talk about the paints we use and what we use and why we use them, because you don't normally get told these sorts of things. So, how do I normally start? So, historically, most artists, up until about the middle of the 19th century, would have used a fairly limited range of colours. And most artists would have used almost the same colours. So the colours that Titian used were probably very similar to the colours that Velasquez used, or Franz Holst used, or even up until the middle of the 19th century. All the British school painters all used pretty much the same colours. And they are basically the colours that we use in our own limited palette today. They're very time tested. They've worked for a lot of the greatest artists. When you go and see paintings on the walls in galleries, chances are they've been painted with the colours that we'll be discussing now. So the first colours were, the very first colours go back to some prehistoric times when, with the cave paintings and the cave dwellers who would mix coloured earth with blood or with water or whatever they used to bind it. And actually, funnily enough, those colours are pretty much the colours that we're still using now. So the basic limited flesh painting traditional palette is really white, yellow ochre, red ochre, maybe a brown, and usually a black. Traditionally, there would have been a black. The white would, up until 100 years or so ago, have been white lead. So the Greeks were the first people who learned how to make lead white from burying lead in animal dung, and it would slowly change chemically and produce a white powder. And that would have been the white. That was the white pigment, apart from chalk, right the way until zinc white came in, I think, in about 1850, and that was introduced by Winsor and Newton, and that was a watercolour pigment. So although you can get oil paint with zinc, it doesn't work terribly well in oils, although Delaslo used zinc white for his white. So lead white is a little bit frowned upon today because of course it is toxic if you eat it or rub it into your skin, all of which I've done and I'm fine. But if you use it sensibly, it's okay. But it is getting more and more difficult to get. In theory, you need to be a restorer or something nowadays, but I think Michael Harding still sell it. Natural Pigments, Supreme Pigments sell it. And the thing about lead white is it's a nice colour. So titanium white, which wasn't actually introduced until about 1910, I call it a refrigerator white. It's a very opaque, rather cold white, like you'd paint on a refrigerator. And it also tends to, when you use it in mixes with other colours, it tends to make them rather opaque and rather flat as well. So your painting almost has a look of being slightly sunk in. And zinc white I just mentioned. Lead white has this wonderful quality. It's got a lovely feel to it when you hand it under the brush. It's a nice colour, and you could, if you use a lot of medium in it, you could actually use it in a sort of semi-transparent wash, which is called a scumble. And when you grind it quite thickly, it's got wonderful tactile qualities for highlights and that sort of thing. You said you've had an old tube, didn't you, from last year? You said it had wonderful stringy quality.
It's amazing.
Yeah. And there's nothing like any of the paints that you buy, even the lead white in particular actually, is the best one of all is when you grind it yourself. You can't get in a tube, it just doesn't have the same, it's not the same. And I've got pigments upstairs, and we could actually have a pigment grinding session at some point, okay? I think you made some white lead last year, didn't you?
Yeah, that's the one, it was that Conal's
Yeah.
one that you had, yeah.
So that's the white. Then yellow ochre, and then red ochre, and the browns, which would be an umber, burnt umber or raw umber, and one of the blacks. So I've got these colour charts here, because although we say, you think, right, I'll just go and buy yellow ochre, it's not quite as simple as that, because they all behave slightly differently. So when you do buy a tube of paint, usually on it, especially if it's an artist quality paint, they're not necessarily as big as that of course, but it'll have the name of the paint on it, but it will also have a certain few bits of information. So this has got PR102, and it says calcined natural iron oxide. So the PR number, the P number, is telling you it's a PR is pigment red, yellow ochres are PY, they're usually PY43. We've got the vermilions here, that's a PR again, that's a pigment red. Black is PB, proves our pigment black, I think, and blues are PBL. So they'll always have that on there and they'll have a number, okay? So yellow ochre, as I say, is PY43, and they can behave very differently. So the way I like to, or if you want to become more familiar with your colours, the thing to do is to add a little bit of white, and that brings out what's called the undertone, okay? And if you see adding white to all these colours that look similar across the top, they're actually quite different according to the so-called undertones. So that's a Zeki raw sienna there, which is actually quite pink. It's almost a flesh tone in itself. Whereas that's Old Holland light yellow light. That's a Williamsburg Italian ochre. That's quite a neutral one there. Those are actually Naples yellow there. And for flesh paint, you'd normally want a yellow ochre that inclines a bit towards the brown or the orange rather than the green. For landscapes, you might want one that goes towards the green. And the only real difference between yellow ochre and raw sienna is raw sienna obviously comes from sienna. It's just a more transparent version of a yellow ochre. I think it's still even the PY43. I could check, but I think it's the same. So that's the yellow, and that again goes back to prehistoric times. So yellow ochre is just like people have used it around history, and we're still using it today. It's really reliable, and it's very stable, and it lasts very well. In fact, all these colours that I'm going to show you, I'm going to say they're friendly colours because they all mix together very harmoniously. They're easy to use. Now, the most interesting colour on the palette, I think, is your earth red, okay? So we'll come to vermilion in a moment, but the earth reds, again, prehistoric, so an earth red is basically a red ochre. And again, superficially they look rather similar, but you can see how different they are according to the undertone that's coming out by the addition of white. So this one, which is called Old Holland Light Red, which is a great colour, okay, that mixed with white off the bat gives you a really good flesh colour. So yes, we can use vermilions and ochres to make a flesh tone, but vermilion is traditionally extremely expensive, and certainly for underpainting, I only ever really use earth colours at all. I don't really use vermilion, mainly because I haven't found one that does, because they all vary, and I've not really found one that does the job I'd like it to do. So the thing to note about the earth reds are there are two basic types. You have a calcined natural ochre. Calcined just means it's been roasted. Okay, so when you've got raw umber and a burnt umber, the burnt tells you it's raw umber that's being heated and it changes the pigment. Same with raw sienna and burnt sienna. And actually, if you burn or you roast yellow ochre, it becomes red ochre, but we don't call it that. So you have these calcined natural ochres, okay, which are kind of pretty much found in the ground in different places. And they are quite gentle and very friendly. Then you also have a range of earth colours that usually have names of places like English red or Indian red or Venetian red or Persian red, and they are actually slightly different. They are called synthetic iron oxides, and they've got a slightly different makeup, and they tend to be very, very much more powerful, and they usually go veer towards the cooler colours, whereas the natural ones tend to go towards the warmer flesh tones. So most of the time, and this goes back to a book I discovered, written in 1756 by someone called Thomas Bardwell. So when I was at HC, I did lots and lots of research about our tradition, what we were doing, why we were doing it, etc., etc. And I came across this book called by Thomas Bardwell. I can't remember what it's called now, but in it he listed the colours that one uses for portraiture and why. And when he wrote it, he begins the book by lamenting the fact that that only 100 years before him, Van Dyck, etc., were painting. And he says, why didn't they write down what they were doing? Why didn't anyone record it? So he said, what I'm going to do is try and piece it all together. So it's the earliest real record that gives us an insight into maybe Van Dyck's practices, apart from what you can see when you look at the unfinished studies that I love. And so Bardwell gives us different colours, and one of the things he says, for underpainting flesh tones or for flesh tones, you can do a lot worse than using this colour called light red. So I didn't really know what light red was. I thought it's a light Caribbean red or a light vermilion, but it's not. It's actually an earth colour called light red. In Italian it would be rosso chiaro, in French it would be rouge clair. They do all, it goes under other names as well. In fact, that one there, yellow ochre burnt, which is an old Holland colour, it's the same pigment, slightly different undertone. And he said, mix the light red with white and you get a very good general purpose flesh tone. And in fact, I think that Van Dyck, on these studies that he's done here, I think there is vermilion in there, because he would have used vermilion. These were painted from life, but they were painted from life not to actually be finished portraits. They were studies that he was going to use for a vast painting that had 21 life-size figures in it, called the Magistrates of Brussels, which was destroyed by the French. And he did a number of these studies for the painting. These were the only two that survived until fairly recently, and these are in the Ashmolean Museum. And I actually went, when I was writing my book, I went to see them, and they brought the painting out, and I was given white gloves, and I could use magnifying glasses and all sorts of things. But since then, about 3 or 4 more have come to light. So one came up on the Antiques Roadshow, and when it came up on the Antiques Roadshow, I immediately recognised what it was, although it had been repainted. And I wrote to Philip Mould, who was doing the conservation at the time, and I said, I think that painting is one of those series that Van Dyck did for the Magistrates of Brussels. And I sent him a copy of my book and all loads of it. I never heard a word back. And then when, of course, it was presented when it was all cleaned and presented on the roadshow 6 months later, I said, oh yes, part of that series, Magistrates of Brussels. Now, I'm not saying I was the only one who noticed that, but he could have acknowledged it. And then I used to have a friend who worked at Christie's, and he said, we've just had one of these come in, if you want to come and see it. So I went there and had a look at another one that had come up, and one come to light in Holland as well, that Urban found. So they're great. I personally love these paintings. It's all linked, by the way. So as lay-ins, Van Dyck was probably not using his vastly expensive vermilion, but he might have been using it there. In fact, I know what the colours are that have been analysed in this. So these are yellow ochres, red ochres. This isn't black, it's a colour called bistre, which is made from burnt wood. That, I should think, is maybe an hour and a half's work. That is a little bit more. He's actually sort of gone back in on top of that and started reinforcing his original drawing and characterising through there. He's got the highlights in right at the beginning, because they're great markers. And I just love the brushwork. To me, it's kind of modern painting. So with my research into Thomas Bardwell and looking at these paintings and how they're done, and the influence, of course, Van Dyck had on everyone that followed, has very much influenced my way of interpretation of doing the teaching. And you'll also note that we're on a grey primed canvas, okay? Actually, originally it's red bole, okay, which is a red earth colour, which was introduced, Venetian painters painted on red bole because they like the dramatic effect of light and dark. And as you know, when you paint on white, you can't really see what you've done until the whole thing's covered. Whereas if you're working on red bole, the white jumps out. The only thing, when the colours tend to sink into red bole, and unless the paintings are very well crafted, you can see a lot of old standing paintings, and they're just really dark, except for a few white light patches. But at about this time, at about 1600, these are 1630, I think, many painters, particularly in Northern Europe, in Holland mainly, started to put the grey on top of the red, and that's what you can see is happening here. So Velasquez used grey, and of course Velasquez and Van Dyck are exact contemporaries, both born in 1599. And also, as the way I have said, this is what's called dead colouring. So we're not going for the full-on colour effect straight away. We're building up to it on the softly, catchy monkey technique. So that's how some of these colours relate to the paintings there. So I think the earth colours are really important because you can, when I painted Grace, I actually used English red, which is that one there, because she's got a bit of pink complexion, okay, than that. So you can actually exploit the colours, if you wish, to use them, to do that. And there's another shot here, again, with sort of done slightly differently, the same principle, add in more white, and you can see how that is just completely different from that, you know. So that can be useful to know. Then we come on to the bright red, vermilion. So vermilion is also a very traditional colour. When I first went to Florence 30 years ago, our palette was white lead, vermilion, and a colour called Pozzuoli, which is that one there, okay, which is a red earth from Pozzuoli, which is down near Naples, and of course black, and I think that was, and yellow ochre, of course. That was Charles's interpretation, but he actually trained with Gamble, using light red and Indian red, which are really the two extremes of the earth red. So that's giving you your warmer colours, that's giving you cooler colours. Not very useful in flesh tones, but very good in things like hair, or for making purpley highlights and things like that in hair. Charles still likes to use vermilion. The irony is, it's really difficult to get good vermilion. And actually, this is my collection of vermilion there, that Sandro Zecchi has given me loads of these over the years. So these in here are called Chinagro, and this is just a natural rock that's been cleaned, and that was the original vermilion. Whereas these colours are what's called mercuric sulfide. So the Chinese learned how to combine mercury and sulfide, and knowledge of how to do that came to the west with Genghis Khan when they moved moved westwards. But they're all slightly different. This is about 100-year-old winter Newton pigment, vermilion. That's a really good colour, it's quite orangey. The vermilion is called either Chinese vermilion or French vermilion. So the Chinese vermilion is the more orangey one, whereas the French one is more of that sort of colour, although that is actually, this is from Monte Amiato, which is about an hour south of Florence, and there's a little quarry there that produces real vermilion, very rare. So vermilion is great, but you need to have the right one. And I think I've got a tiny bit left. These are white if I choose one of them as well, that I've collected over the years, ironically, because I don't really use it. But there's one that Zecchi's did about 15 years ago that was really good. You could almost see the mercury in it. It almost had this sort of silvery quality. It was amazing. But most of the other ones I've had since then haven't had that. And it was really nice in flesh tones because it was warm, but it had a cool quality as well. So again, with adding the white, we can see the very different undertones that are coming out from the vermilion. Most of the undertones are fairly cool. That is one that Zecchi made, probably still make it, which they had tweaked to give a very orangey sort of colour, because all the schools of Florence wanted a more orangey vermilion. But actually, these are most of the other vermilions. They're not great in the flesh. They're too cool, you know. So there's the vermilion. Of course, nowadays most painters would use cadmium for cadmium colours can match a lot of them. Cadmium colours are, I think cadmium red came out in about 1910 as well. But that can be made to almost exactly match a vermilion. Cadmium colours are pretty nasty as well. I think they're talking in America about banning some of the cadmiums as a heavy metal. So this is just our traditional palette. Of course, there are lots more colours, but these colours that I've talked about were used by pretty much everyone. If you look at the colours Frans Hals used and you look at the colours Velasquez used, there's so many shared ones on there, you know. So that's that, and that only really leaves. So there's two different vermilions again. That's a Chinese vermilion. That's a French vermilion. That's real Naples yellow, that's real Naples yellow. So Naples yellow obviously comes from, I think it comes from from the fallout of Mount Vesuvius. Again, not very often nowadays. Most people would use a cadmium yellow, but I wanted to get the real ones and I got them. So that's a Naples yellow light and a Naples yellow deep. And then we should somewhere have a black one, but I don't know if black was here. So with the blacks, we use ivory black. That's it's the coolest, and in fact it serves for most purposes as a blue. So if you're painting blue eyes like that girl up there, then I wouldn't use blue in the eyes. It just looked too chocolate boxy, too synthetic. Whereas black, well, there's a bit there, black and white. It gives you a nice, cool, fairly neutral colour there. That when it's seen next to those red colours, pretty much acts as a blue. Of course, you can use it for itself. They say that, I think Van Gogh wrote that he found about 40 different blacks in Frans Hals' painting. He said he's absolutely martial using black. But the other great thing about black is that it's great for neutralising a colour. So if it makes up a flesh tone that's too orange or something, you could just put a tiny bit of black in it. It'll just neutralise it and make it much more naturalistic. Which is why I actually wiped back that picture off Grace the other day, because it was just too loud. I'm going to paint it much more subtly when I get back to it. But you've also got, what other blacks do you get? You get ivory black is the one we use. You can get a peach black,
Vine black, lamp black,
and actually if you add the white to those, you'll see they're quite brownish and then very warm, much more warm. So that's kind of the colours. We don't really use a blue because, as I say, it just doesn't, you don't need it in flesh tones. People would say, oh, I really want to get into the colour or whatever. But actually when you're talking about painting portraits, there's not a lot of colour going on there anyway. You want colours that really work nicely together, I think, and harmonise nicely. So that's the colours. I'll just quickly touch on mediums because Hull, we've been talking with Hull about mediums. So again, traditionally, most mediums, I'll say up until the First World War, most of what we're talking about, most artists would have known. Since the First World War, all that knowledge has slowly just gone less and less and less. And a lot of people paint today not really knowing what they're using at all, or not knowing what they could be using. Like you painted with the linseed oil and not realising you could to make a traditional medium, you'd have an oil, a varnish or a resin, same thing, and a spirit, turpentine. They all do more or less the same thing. They're all really like different flavours of coffee in a way. So we do, when I was in Italy, we used to use sun thickened oil, which we used to thicken ourselves in lead trays, and we used to make lead trays and put them out on the roof and leave them for about 2 months, and it would thicken and it would absorb the lead. But when I came back and I sort of like see how these things, if they were colour fast, I did big panels and I would a big bit of sun thickened oil, a big bit of stand oil, a big bit of, I don't know, Venetian turpentine, put them in a drawer and looked at them every couple of months, and then the sun thickened oil went really yellow. So now I tend to personally prefer stand oil, which behaves in the same way. It's a thickened oil as well, but it doesn't yellow. I think stand oil and sun thickened oil were originally the same thing. I think it was just literally leaving the oil to stand and oxidize, whereas now this is heated without oxygen, and it polymerizes it, and it makes it changes it slightly. But this doesn't yellow. It's really nice to use. But with the varnish aspect of it, I'm now using Damar, just because Canada balsam is just quite incredibly expensive. You could use mastic, Damar, Venetian terps, Strasbourg terps, all sorts of different Canada balsam, and you can vary the mixture. So I think Al and myself and Helen, we like about 50% oil, about 25% varnish and about 25% turpentine, and then we'll dilute that further for sort of laying in or as a general purpose day-to-day medium. And again, going back to the grey ground, so as you know, if you've come and study here are normally able to start on white, so you learn about creating all the different values yourself. But after a certain amount of time, we usually transfer to a grey paper because you can use the white and because it leads into the painting in a logical way, because we always tint our grounds to give the toned ground colour we like. And I was just going to quickly show you how to do that before we finish. So, anything else you'd like me to touch on? No?
What about walnut oil?
Walnut oil is great. It doesn't yellow as much as linseed oil, so it's used often for making your white or your blue colours. It's a bit more greasy under the brush, so actually I still prefer the linseed oil when I'm making the white. But you could, you could definitely use walnut oil instead. It's more slow drying and it doesn't yellow as much, but it's a bit more greasy. So the varnish aspect is really allowing the paint to kind of gel up more, because the linseed oil will dry by oxidizing from the surface down, and that usually takes a couple of days, so it tends to be rather slippery and slidey. Whereas if you put a bit of varnish in your medium, it dries evenly throughout the film most of the time, and it usually will tack up overnight in such a way that you can then paint on it the next day. Whereas with linseed oil on its own, it's probably still going to be wet, which you might like. And as I say, they're all, the one I'm using now, the Damart on stand oil, is actually a pretty standard 19th century medium. Whereas the previous one we used with the sun thickened oil with Canada balsam is very like a 17th century medium. Okay, so sort of the Rubens Van Dyke would use. But they do the same kind of thing. So anyway, so I've just stretched up that canvas, and I'll just show you the quickest and the easiest way to tint a canvas. It's the last bit of the day's performance. Can I borrow some white tissue paper? I'll bring some into one.
Nick, was that the medium that you mixed just before I left the demo?
I can't remember.
It became kind of jelly.
No, that one I've still got. It is a gel, I haven't used it yet.
What is that?
That was, yes it was. That was like the one.
And the varnish, did I hear that you're not using a gloss Damar, you're
I'm
using
using a slightly satin Damar because stand oil is very glossy, so it's just taking the surface, just taking it back just a smidge. So I'm just wetting the surface there. Let's see if we can put the colours on, they go on easily and evenly. So well, I'll show you. So we've got a little bit of black and a little bit of white lead. Could be whatever you want. White lead white. And I'm going to put a raw umber in there because the black and the white on its own will be too cool, I should think. Come on. And raw umber. Anyone got a bit of raw umber? Thanks, Al. Thank you. There we go. Put a bit of raw umber in there as well, which will just warm it up a tad and stop it being too cool. Also, the umber has, I think it's manganese in it, which is a fast dryer, and also white lead is a fast dryer, so it's also going to help with the drying. And then all we do is, you could put, if you wanted it to dry quickly, we'd maybe put a couple of drops of liquid on there as well. All we can do is that. I'll probably have to get you a whole roll of this. Just keep doing that now. I think this works really well on this facing canvas.
Is that the 66?
That is the 66, yeah. So that's very like the sort of ground that Rubens like to paint on with those sort of streaks. I probably could have put a bit more umber in there. See, it's getting a little bit like that colour there. And the nice thing about doing this is you've still got the white, the canvas, giving it a bit of luminosity. Whereas if you actually tint the ground that colour, you don't have that luminosity to have the white. Oil paint is to a certain extent transparent, and the light goes through the paint and bounces back off the canvas, which is why those dark browns of Venetian you go brown, because there's no paint will also get darker as it gets older. So if things get darker and the light's not reflected back through it, then they will disappear. There we are. So that's looking pretty good, I think now. Nice and even. And that's a really nice colour to work on, and it's not dissimilar to the natural colour of the linen. Very similar colour. So that's good to go.
Nick,
Yeah.
is that another reason why people like lead white, because of the transparency of it in terms of as the light passes through it, it will reflect back and more? I think
Possibly, yeah.
I can't remember if I heard it about lead white or whether it was something to do with the difference between the cremnitz and lead because of the flakes.
Cremnitz and lead are more or less the same thing.
But it's like in terms of the genetic makeup of it or the chemical makeup of it, so the flakes are different sizes or something.
Flake
Shapes.
technically I think is what they use
Flake
if it's got a bit of zinc in there as well. But it's pretty much interchangeable, I think you'll find. So there we are. That's a little talk about what we use and why we use it. We're part of a tradition, we're not slaves to a tradition, but those colours will do pretty much anything you want if you learn how to use them. And of course you can add other colours if you need them for anything in particular. But that is a good traditional palette used by just about everyone you can think of up until, well, this 20th century, I suppose, when people just use anything without knowing what they're using at all.